This video is for technicians in the field to identify issues with the pressure gauges on the LCS ship and also proper calibration procedures with those gauges. The first condition we'll take a look at is overranged. This happens when the gauge sees a pressure which is more than the full pressure of the pressure gauge. This failure mode can be easily identified. The system pressure will be at zero, or your test gauge will be at zero, but the gauge being tested in the system will show a positive pressure, like the one pictured here where the needle is sitting up at 4 psi, yet the system pressure is at zero. Here the 60-pound gauge may have seen 100 psi. This can happen due to possibly the gauge being undersized at time of install, or a pressure surge from a valve being opened inadvertently, which causes more pressure to go to that system than was originally intended to. A good rule of thumb is that the pressure should be reading in the 12 o'clock position of the pressure gauge. There's not much that can be done to a gauge that has been overpressurized. It cannot be repaired in place. It will need to be taken out and replaced or repaired at a calibration lab. The next issue we'll take a look at is sluggish or even no movement of the pointer when pressure is applied. The most common issue is the gauge snubber, which is located behind the gauge board. The snubber has a singed, porous snubbing element inside of it, which when becomes clogged will stop any flow of pressure through it. In order to check for this, you will need to remove the snubber and apply pressure to the gauge without going through the snubber. If the gauge works, then you know the snubber needs to be cleaned or replaced. The second issue can be found on gauges that are used on non-seawater applications. Inside the 1/4-inch NPT connection of the gauge is a restrictor. This restrictor has a small hole in it, 20 thousandths. Sometimes this can become clogged as well. By removing the elbow, it will expose the restrictor. It is of the utmost importance when removing the elbow or reinstalling the elbow that you use 2 wrenches to hold back on the wrench flats on the back of the case. If you see debris in the restrictor, you can remove the debris and reopen the hole. This should solve your problems. You will need to then rehook up the gauge and test. Something that to take note of is that if you do remove the elbow, it is very important that the elbow is reinstalled in a straight line downward on the pressure gauge. There's some pictures here showing to the left or to the right. It needs to be perpendicular with the mounting bracket. Also, if you go to the front side of this website, you'll find a video on gauge installation. Please take a look at that as well when you're bolting the gauge back into the panel. Testing gauge accuracy. This is done by using a master gauge and comparing it to the gauge being tested in the gauge board. The system pressure accuracy spec for LCS on gauge boards is plus or minus 5% full scale. So on a 100 psi gauge, you are allowed plus or minus 5 psi. Testing differential gauge board. For this, you will need 2 master pressure gauges. First, you will need to hook one up to the high port and one to the low port. On the gauge board pictured here, it's a 0 to 100 psi-D. What you'll want to do first is apply 100 psi to the high port. Then you'll want to apply 100 psi to the low port. This will bring the needle back to 0. Then you can start your calibration procedure. By increasing the high port to 150 psi, now the needle on the gauge differential board should read 50 psi, and then you can increase the pressure to 200 psi on the high side, and the gauge on the differential gauge board should now read 100 psi. It is essential that you have pressure to both the high and the low ports when testing the accuracy of this differential gauge board. Of course, if your gauge board is 0 to 10 psi, then you would apply 10 psi to the high side, 10 psi to the low side, and then work your way up to 15 and 20, and then so forth. It is also worth noting that the accuracy spec on the differential pressure gauge is also plus or minus 5% full scale accuracy.